This week on Inside Scoop, the big, not-so-beautiful breakup between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, drones and the new way of war, and RFK Jr. takes on artificial food dyes. Welcome to Inside Scoop, where we talk about all the news that's fit to print in the Washington Examiner magazine. I'm Jim Antle, your host. Only in Washington can a process called reconciliation tear people apart, but that's what seems to have happened between President Donald Trump and his former advisor and ally Elon Musk over the big, beautiful bill. The big, beautiful bill has caused a big, not so beautiful bromance breakup. So in less than a week's time, the Trump-Musk relationship went from this.
Well, I expect to continue to provide advice whenever the president would like advice.
I hope so.
I expect to remain a friend and an advisor, and certainly if there's anything the president wants me to do, I'm at the president's service.
To this.
I'm very disappointed because Elon knew the inner workings of this bill. I don't know what it is. It's sort of Trump derangement syndrome, I guess they call it. But we have it with others, too. They leave, and they wake up in the morning, and the glamour's gone. The whole world is different, and they become hostile. He had no problem with it. All of a sudden, he had a problem. And he only developed the problem when he found out that we're going to have to cut the EV mandate.
Musk's portfolio inside the administration was DOGE, a department that was tasked with rooting out government waste and fraud, but ultimately had hoped to achieve major savings in government spending. Musk dissented from the big, beautiful bill on the grounds that it didn't do enough to cut long-term deficits and therefore undermined the whole DOGE project.
I think a bill can be big or it can be beautiful, but I don't know if it can be both. My personal opinion.
Trump, as you've heard, has said that Musk is really more interested in preserving the electric vehicle mandates and subsidies that are cut out in the Republican reconciliation bill. This becomes a problem because the bill only passed by one vote in the House, and a lot of fiscal hawks in the Senate, which is now considering the legislation, are put off by the spending and are emboldened by Musk's dissents. This bill needs to pass in order to extend the Trump tax cuts and avoid an across-the-board tax increase, and it also contains a lot of Trump's immigration funding priorities. But the battle between Trump and Musk seems very difficult to walk back from. Musk said that Trump is part of the Jeffrey Epstein files and otherwise has made threats about political involvement, maybe getting involved in a third party for centrists that could potentially take votes away from Republicans. Trump has warned Musk not to get involved in funding Democratic candidates or to intervene against Republicans in the midterm elections, suggesting that perhaps Musk's own government contracts and subsidies could be put at risk by his newfound political opposition to the White House. Whose side are you on, and will Trump and Musk ever get back together? Will there be a true reconciliation? Comment down below. On the cover this week in the Washington Examiner magazine, drones and the future of warfare. And I'm joined today by Washington Examiner's senior writer for national security, Jamie McIntyre. Jamie, you've written this piece, and it takes a look at what happened in Ukraine when Ukraine launched, I think what surprised a lot of people, their capability to do this with this attack on Russia. Unpack a little bit for us what happened.
So Jim, anybody who follows what's going on with warfare in the military knows that there's a revolution involving the use of drone warfare. But this episode in Ukraine, June 1st, was, I would say, it's like the evolution of the revolution. It was ingenious, it was creative, and I think almost every account of it used the word audacious. Mm-hmm. And basically what they did was they, in an operation that was meticulously planned over a year and a half, they snuck in over 100 drones in containers or little things that look like cabins or mobile homes on the back of trucks, stationed them all around deep into Russia. Some of the drivers who drove them didn't know what they were driving. And they had these drones hidden in the top of them in a separate container, and they were able to pop the roof off of these containers by remote control, fly the drones from thousands of miles away in Ukraine and attack 4 or 5 different Russian air bases. And depending on who you believe, they either destroyed about 20 of Russia's long-range bombers, some of these nuclear-capable bombers, so it's part of their triad, or Ukraine claims that they got over 40 of them, causing $7 billion of damage. It's, you know, in Russia, they started referring to it as Russia's Pearl Harbor,
Sure.
which I think is a good comparison because it really took them completely by surprise. But also, like Pearl Harbor, it's not likely to be the decisive battle of the war. You know, Pearl Harbor didn't win the war for Japan,
Right.
But it sure was a wake-up call, and this was a big wake-up call.
So what do you think it does in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war? You know, does it maybe strengthen Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table? Does it set any of those types of talks back further?
Well, so I wrote in the article on the cover that, you know, Trump dressed Zelensky down when he was at the White House and said he didn't have the cards. And at the time, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky knew quite well that this operation was going to be sprung. So, as I said, it turned out he did have some cards up his sleeve, and in fact, one of them was a Trump card. But what I think it does is it sends a couple of big messages. One is that Ukraine is not in any mood to just surrender. There's a lot of fight in them, and Ukraine, of course, has been consistently underestimated from the very beginning of the war, because, of course, they're overmatched by a superpower. They're a country that's, has just 1/4 of the population that Russia has. But it also sent a message to President Trump that they do have some tricks up their sleeve. They do have things they can do. And since that attack, by the way, there have been some other pretty notable attacks. The Ukrainians were able to shoot down one of Russia's top-of-the-line fighter jets over Russian territory with one of the F-16s that they've been provided by the Allies. They conducted a successful attack on a logistics train where they destroyed a number of tanks that were being taken to the front line. So they're battling back. So I think it sends that message as well, that, you know, people who think, well, they're losing the war and they're going to lose, it's going to be a tough battle. And I think that people who are fighting for their freedom and their sovereignty and don't want to be taken over by Russia, they're battling pretty hard.
What does this mean, you know, the prevalence of drones and the emergence of drones, what does this mean for warfare beyond the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Does this have implications for major powers like the United States or China?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of debate in recent years about whether the United States has been slow to recognize that some of these big, exquisite, expensive weapon systems that we're spending money on, aircraft carriers and top-of-the-line fighter jets, is that really where we should be spending most of our money? Or should we be developing more drones, these cheap disposable drones like Ukraine used, and specifically counter-drone warfare? Because you have to think about this. If Ukraine was able to sneak in over 100 drones into a police state like Russia, how hard would it be for somebody to get a rental truck and sneak drones in somewhere near a U.S. military base? And you recall, just wasn't that long ago, we were all concerned about Chinese companies buying land too close to U.S. military bases where they thought they might be spying or there might be sabotage.
Right.
But now you can imagine with any terrorist who could build these cheap drones in their garage and launch them into a base. You know, our bases, our planes, many of these bases are out on the tarmac in the same way that the Russian planes were out there, vulnerable to drone attack. I think it's going to create a reassessment of where we should be spending our money in order to protect the assets that we have at home, and also how we might launch, a war in the future. Taiwan has to be looking at what Ukraine has done with drones, and Ukraine now produces an enormous amount of indigenous drones, these small quadcopters, and they have to be thinking we need to be doing the same thing. We need to have that kind of drone capability if we're going to deter China from either blockading or trying to take over, Taiwan. So I think it has enormous implications.
Thank you, Jamie. If you're following us on YouTube, you can read Jamie's full article by clicking here on the digital magazine. The Trump administration is taking aim at artificial food dyes. Our Amy DeLaura explains how confusion reigns about the administration's next steps.
We're poisoning this generation.
Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has focused on the threat of artificial food dyes, promoting natural alternatives instead. However, when Kennedy announced an artificial food dye ban in late April, it was difficult to determine if the executive action was a straight-up ban or simply a phase-out, and how long this phase-out would last.
We've been working with the food industry, and we found the food industry very, very receptive. We think we have good science that links almost all of these dyes with ADHD, with neurological injury, with cancer.
Well, the news release from FDA does detail 6 actions it will take. First, it is to establish a national standard and timeline for the food industry to transition from petroleum-based dyes to natural alternatives. The second indicates the FDA will be, quote, initiating the process to revoke authorization for 2 dyes, which will occur within the coming months. So starting the process, but not actually banning those 2 dyes.
And they've agreed to phase out the 2 worst of them.
The third measure begins with working with the industry to eliminate a half a dozen other dyes. Again, continuing to use language that doesn't clarify a timeline of when the agency wants to explicitly ban these dyes. The remaining actions do the same, with one saying it will partner with the National Institutes of Health to research how dyes affect children's health and development. However, in the same release, Kennedy calls these dyes poisonous and claims they already pose measurable dangers to children's health and development. So, what's the research for if Kennedy has already concluded it does negatively affect children? When Kennedy recently testified for the House Appropriations Committee, he got into a tense exchange with Representative Rosa DeLauro, the panel's ranking member.
Congressman DeLauro, you say that you've worked for 20 years on getting food dye out. Give me credit. I got it out in 100 days.
However, questions remain regarding precisely how the administration will make that happen. Recent Supreme Court rulings have curtailed executive agency authority to implement rules and regulations without specific authority from Congress. That could explain the vague language in the release rather than a direct ban. Such a move would likely face legal scrutiny and be ensnared in the courts for several years. Without any clear enforcement mechanism, companies using dyes in food could go through the motions with the administration, but just continue to use the dyes. However, Trump's recent nomination of Casey Means for Surgeon General reflects a move in support of the MAHA movement.
People know that something's not right, and people know that this health issue is the tip of the iceberg of what's actually happening in our world today.
Means is also an advocate for doing away with the artificial dyes. Kennedy is, of course, a true believer, so it's possible the duo won't let it lie, even if Trump declares it a win. If that's the case, we could see another political infight within this administration. Back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Amy. And this has been your Inside Scoop. You can read this story and all the articles we've discussed today in our Washington Examiner magazine. I'm Jim Antle, and we'll catch you next time.